Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patsy and I'm the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this symposium, Climate Change and Displacement, Experiences from Latin America and the Caribbean and the Middle East. It's my distinct pleasure that our first event for the semester is a collaboration with the Center of Middle East Studies and its director, Professor Nadje Al-Ali. And we are hoping to explore the various implications that climate change has for migration and how these are experienced across the two regions not in close proximity. We thought it would be a great idea to bring our regions into conversation on this important issue, both to see the ways in which the effects are similarly felt, but also how the particular physical and political geographies of the two regions might have a differential impact on the topic. So we're very excited to have this cross-regional conversation. Of course, migration and climate change are two of the huge issues of our time in a period when there are many big global issues, but we thought it would be really interesting just to see not just what the current effects are, both as a causal factor, but also how climate change affects how migrants experience migration, but also to look a bit to the future to see what we can expect as the effects of climate change intensifies. I'm particularly happy that we're able to bring together 4 incredible scholars and activists from our 2 regions, Sabine Manigat, Lucilla Nayam-Keys, Yara Assi, and Dina Najjar. And welcome to you, our audience, and welcome to our panelists, and thank you so much for being here. I will now turn it over to Professor Al-Ali for her comments.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Patsy. It's also, I'm very happy, like you said, for this first event of the semester being a collaborative event with you and your center. So my name is Nadje Al-Ali. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown. And, one of the really exciting things about the various centers being housed in the Watson Institute is that it allows for this collaboration. And I think both Patsy and I have been thinking that while it's important to zoom in to the specifics of either the Middle East, Latin America, or the Caribbean, it's also important to de-exceptionalize the regions and look at commonalities and differences as well. And for me personally, I'm very interested in introducing a gender angle into the various big issues that we are looking at, and to really make the point across the board that a gender lens is not just a side issue, but it is actually a very important angle to understand climate change, to understand conflict, understand changes in labor patterns and also migration. And so one of the important things that we want to address today is the intersection of conflict, climate change, migration, and gender. And so what we're going to be doing after introducing the speakers, we'll be in conversation for about an hour or so, and we encourage you at any moment to post any question or comment through the Q&A function, and we will have time, hopefully, we'll make time to have a discussion with you afterwards. So please, if you have any comment or question, put it through the Q&A function. And I should also say that there is, for those of us who are joining us, Spanish speaking, we have also simultaneous interpretation available on the interpretation channel. You find English and Spanish, so you can move between the two. Okay, back to you, Patsy.
Thank you, Nadje. I will introduce 2 of the panelists, and Nadje will introduce the other 2 panelists. We will be posing a general question to allow each panelist to speak for a few moments about their own work. And we will have a discussion amongst ourselves, and then we'll open the discussion up to our audience for comments and questions. I'd like to introduce Sabine Manigat. Sabine Manigat is a professor at the State University of Haiti and Quisqueya University in Port-au-Prince. She received a bachelor's degree in international relations from the Paris Institute of Political Studies and the University of Paris, and a master's of science degree from the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences, Flaxo, Mexico, where she taught and researched up to 1986. Her research and publications focus on Haiti's history and political system, Caribbean relations, and international migrations. Her publications include Haiti y Democracia, El Movimiento Social Haitiano entre Partidos y Estado, 1986-2006, Las Migraciones Internacionales de los Haitianos, una cultura, un drama, La dinámica histórica de las migraciones en Haití y México, hacia una nueva política de cooperación, edited in El Colegio de México. Thank you for joining us, Sabine. Lucila Niamkis is the Craig M. Kogod Professor, Visiting Professor at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies for this academic year. And I just want to say how really thrilled I am that she has been with us, that she's with us this academic year. Lucila is from Argentina and is currently a researcher in the Technological and Scientific Research National Council, CONICET, an associate professor at Arturo Wojciech. I probably have mispronounced this, apologies, Lucila, National University, and an associate researcher at IDAES, National University of San Martin, UNSAM, where she co-directs a Migration Studies Center. Her work focuses on migration in Argentina and Mercosur through a variety of frameworks dealing with public policy, the state, nationality, citizenship, and human rights.
Great. Well, welcome, Sabine and Lucila. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dina Nadje. Dina Nadje joined the International Center for Agricultural Research in the Dry Areas in 2014 as a social and gender specialist. Socio-cultural anthropologist by training, she focuses on the link between gender equality and policies, agricultural technologies and delivery systems, rural employment and migration, adaptation to climate change, and productive assets, including access to land and ownership in the Middle East and North Africa. Her geographical expertise includes Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Sudan. She has also conducted research in Uzbekistan, Kenya, Ethiopia, and India. Welcome, Dina. Yera Assi is an assistant professor of global health management and informatics at the University of Central Florida. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and a Fulbright US scholar to the West Bank. Her research focuses on health and development in fragile and conflict-affected areas, including the threats posed by climate change in these contexts. She has written extensively on these topics in peer-reviewed journals and other outlets, including the Washington Post, The Guardian, and The Nation. Very happy you could join us, Yera. Okay, Patsy, would you like to start?
Thank you, Nadje, and welcome to you all again. I would like each of you in turn to speak to your work for around 5 minutes. And it would be great if you could address for us how your interest in and research in migration intersects with climate change, and how is this reflected in your work? What you think are the main issues there? So maybe we can start with Sabine.
Jess? Thank you for welcoming me. I will try to adjust to the 5 minutes. Actually, I've been more interested in international migrations in its intersection with human rights problematics, particularly because Haiti is a migration country, particularly affected by human rights issues wherever the Haitians immigrate. Haiti is, well, I will start, maybe I'll start with the Caribbean. The Caribbean as a region has the reputation of being the first migratory region in relation to its population. In 2019, 10 of the top 20 countries and territories of immigration were in the Caribbean. And speaking of the Caribbean, there is a dynamic in Caribbean migrations that relates to the condition of small islands. Geography has impacted as to the modalities and the circuit used by international migrants. And some similarities between countries of the basin, of the Caribbean basin, illustrate the above, like the boat people modality of moving, the very early culture of migration adopted by the Caribbean populations since, for instance, the construction of the Canal de Panama. So examples that we don't have time for that, but actually there is a culture of migration in the Caribbean. And this culture has been affected by two very recent phenomena. First is that the most prominent flow of immigration out of the region has been evolutioning slowly but steadily, and mainly people migrate towards North America. Like 3/4 of the Caribbean immigrants go to Northern America. But recently there have been some changes, particularly with the Dominicans, the Haitians, and Venezuelans, who tend to migrate more inside the region, which makes that some countries have become also countries not only who expel a lot of migrants, but also receive some migrants, like the Dominican Republic, like Trinidad and Tobago, and Barbados, for instance. The relations with climate change has become more visible since some phenomenon like recurring disasters, earthquakes, the increase in the level of the sea that have affected most of the small islands, including the Caribbean. The countries more affected have been the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Haiti. And these phenomena have caused displacement of thousands of people. But if the Caribbean is not the most spectacular region for this type of phenomena, but it has affected particularly rural families of agricultures, and it has affected particularly women in their economic activities. They have changed they have changed their way of life, and they have changed also the type of work that they have. Maybe I will stop here, just giving a small example of how climate change has affected Haiti and the Dominican Republic. They have a lake, they have two lakes that communicate at the border. And the increase in the level of the lakes has been of more than 8 meters, which has resulted in the loss of agricultural land and urban infrastructures, and also sent a lot of families from the rural areas to the city with all the change in living conditions that affect them. Thank you. I think I went past the 5 minutes.
No, I think you're okay, Sabine. Thank you. Nadje, who should we have next?
Shall we ask Dina? Dina, would you like to respond to that question, please?
Thank you, Nadja. Happy to respond to that question. I have I mean, my work goes at the intersection of migration and climate change. It goes, I would like to describe it as in two ways. The first one is women as staying and high male out migration due to conflict or due to drought or due to compounded conflict and drought. So I've done research on this topic in Tunisia, in Egypt, where because of male out migration and very limited agricultural productivity in these areas, women have increased responsibility to do the farming. But on the other hand, they are not owning land, and also they're not participating at the political level in these agricultural communities. So for example, in rangeland committees on rangeland use, or in water user associations on the use of water, these women are very marginalized, and this has negative implications on both their ability to contribute to national food security, but also on their ability to maximize on their involvement in rangeland use, or to restore these rangeland due to degradation resulting from climate change. So you have some programs that only target men in adaptation measures and not the women. So this validation of women in these roles, in these irrigation roles, in these rangeland use roles is important for them to gain visibility and participate in these governance mechanisms. And also decoupling between landowner status and farmer or livestock herder status. So I think that's important. Now, also what I found is that climate change is not only happening by itself. So there is a lot happening. It's very contextual. So for example, in Egypt, where we looked at these settlements due to government policy to combat climate change and overpopulation in the Nile Valley and Delta, and limited employment to the youth, so many things. They have moved people to areas called the new lands, and these are lands that are irrigated after the building of the High Aswan Dam. So in these areas, women were given land because of pressure from international organizations, or because the government wanted to look like it is implementing gender equity policies. So in these areas, women also migrated as landowners and settlers into these new areas. However, they did not pass on these land titles to their sons. So this highlights that policy measures needs also to be coupled with awareness raising measures at the community level. So the other issue with regards to adaptation to climate change and displacement, I mean, in my study in Morocco, I don't know if I would call it displacement, but if that's the right term, but there was a very dry area, and in areas that are very dry in southern Morocco, as well as due to privatization of land, people lost access to rangelands, and they had to move into these, and not had to, but also the pull, there was a pull in areas where there's very well endowed irrigation measures and big, large land for farming, for export production. These people moved from, they are not migrants, I mean, sorry, they are not refugees, but they moved from these low, poorly endowed resource areas, very dry, into areas which also was compounded by increased drought in these areas. They moved into these areas where the government is investing in irrigation and in export production. And their involvement really, most of these people that are working in these agricultural value chains at this level is in the very, very low level, at the level where they are hired as wage workers during the peak season. And there were two kinds of migrants that we saw. There's these seasonal migrants, and there were the permanent migrants. And the permanent migrants wanted to stake a claim to the land where they were staying on, so that they could actually, they did stake a claim to this land, and they were building houses and selling it, and also bequeathing it, and so on. But also you will find that there's a lot of gender inequalities, in the sense that the pooling of resources in this wage work would happen, and it will be the house or the whatever is bought is in the name of the man and not the woman. So, which is fine as long as there's no marital breakdown. But as you can imagine, when there's marital breakdown, then the women are probably going to be the losers. So we also found wage gaps, big, large wage gaps, 16%.
Yes, sorry, Dina,
Yeah.
to interrupt. I will get back to that if you don't mind on that issue. But just because in the interest of time, if you don't mind if we move on, but I will definitely follow up with you on this. Yeah, is that okay?
Yes, for sure.
Okay, thanks. And thank you. This was so very interesting.
Just the last point.
Yes.
Also the migration, you know, due to climate change doesn't always have to, I mean, one of the reasons is climate change, doesn't always have to be negative. We have seen relaxing in social norms, and women were able to transgress certain social norms and do things like economic activities, or I think economic participation was a big one, that they were not working before, but now they do. That's why they migrated, right? For better economic opportunities. Yeah. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Dina and Sabine, for focusing our attention on the internal dynamics of that kind of migration. I will now invite Lucila to speak for 5 minutes. Lucila.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Muchas gracias, Patsy, muchas gracias, Nadje. Voy a compartir solo un momento de la pantalla para ir rápido. Mi trabajo está centrado en las estrategias socioambientales de las mujeres migrantes en el área Reconquista, en Argentina. Mezcla el cambio climático con la migración y con el género. Lo interesante que escucho, para vincularlo un poco con lo que hablaban las colegas, es que trabajamos con la doble hipótesis porque trabajamos con mujeres migrantes, tanto internas como internacionales, y estas mujeres llegan al área Reconquista, que es en Argentina, en Buenos Aires, a causa de degradaciones vinculadas al cambio climático, sobre todo no solo al cambio climático, sino a la asociación del cambio climático con el modelo productivo, ¿no? Con el neoextractivismo, ¿sí? Y con la gran producción expansiva, agroganadera y sojera de la región del Cono Sur. Vienen principalmente de Bolivia, de Paraguay y del norte de Argentina, Y lo interesante es que sufren o viven un doble sufrimiento ambiental, porque al llegar al área Reconquista en Buenos Aires, Argentina, esta es un área que tiene muchos problemas ambientales porque está a la vera del río Reconquista, que es el segundo más contaminado de la Argentina, y ahí el agua vamos a ver que en todos los casos se repite entre Oriente, Occidente. El tema del agua es muy, muy importante, y se encuentran viviendo al lado de uno de los vertederos basureros, también el primero de la Argentina. Entonces se produce una contaminación ambiental vinculada tanto con el río como el vivir en la basura, ¿sí? En este contexto venimos trabajando hace 3 años con un equipo interdisciplinario. Las condiciones de vulnerabilidad y adaptabilidad al cambio climático que tienen las mujeres migrantes en el área Reconquista, preguntándonos sobre todo sobre el impacto diferencial de estas mujeres que tiene el cambio climático en mujeres y niñas en el acceso a derechos y en la participación, ¿no? Y acá me parece que con la presentación anterior también puedo hacer una vinculación que tiene que ver con los cuidados, ¿no? La participación de las mujeres está muy asociada a todo lo que tiene que ver con cares, ¿no? Las teorías de cuidado, y también con la movilización del barrio y la participación política en el barrio. Y cómo las políticas, también trabajamos las políticas públicas, se relacionan con la igualdad de género o con la desigualdad de género y las estrategias socioambientales que estas mujeres desarrollan en el área. Como es un proyecto de investigación-acción, trabajamos con la perspectiva transformativa, intentamos trabajar en la línea de la intervención directa, y estas mujeres hace 3 años vienen realizando distintas actividades para fortalecer el vínculo entre lo ambiental, la migración y el género, ¿no? En este sentido me gustaba también preguntar o dejar la pregunta al panel para no tampoco extenderme, es, bueno, ¿qué sería el cambio climático? ¿No? ¿Cómo viven estas comunidades el cambio climático? Y cómo lo es traducido localmente de maneras diversas, ¿no? Que esto fue el primer desafío de la investigación cuando llegamos al territorio, porque muchas veces, o la mayoría de las veces, estas mujeres también viven, trabajan y se alimentan en torno a la basura, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, ¿cómo entender el cambio climático en estos contextos? Cómo intersectar o interseccionalmente pensar, ¿no? El origen, el género, la clase, la generación también, porque la generación marca una identidad distinta respecto al comprender lo ambiental. Y sobre todo, y con esto no me quiero extender, sobre todo pensar no solo la feminización de las migraciones vinculadas al cambio climático, sino también la feminización de la pobreza, ¿no? Que con el COVID, con la pandemia de COVID también se ha visto que somos las mujeres las que más empobrecidas se han visto, sobre todo también, vuelvo a lo mismo, por la cuestión de los cuidados. Para terminar, solo digo que en el caso de este área específica, de esta cuenca de río, las mujeres asociaban el riesgo ambiental con la salud, con los cuidados y con las necesidades alimentarias, ¿no? Sobre todo con la salud y con los cuidados del entorno, ¿no? Con los cuidados barriales, con cómo mantener el barrio más limpio, sin tanta basura, cómo consumir el agua sin que estuviera contaminada. En este sentido trabajamos también sobre la alimentación libre de agrotóxicos y sobre los propios saberes de estas mujeres en relación a plantas medicinales que traían desde sus lugares de origen Y bueno, después les puedo compartir, hay un libro muy, muy lindo que ellas escribieron contando las historias respecto a estas plantas. En ese sentido, la soberanía alimentaria también va transversalmente asociado con el cambio climático, el género, la migración y los modelos productivos. Gracias.
Thank you, Lucilla.
Thanks. Yara, would you like to share your insights based on your work, please?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm unable to start my video.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll listen to you then, and then
Okay.
maybe afterwards, maybe you can log in and out because we saw you before, right? So.
Right. It says the host has stopped it, but I'll just.
Oh, the host has stopped it. Okay.
Yeah.
Can we?
Here we go.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
First, I'd like to thank our hosts today at the Center for Middle East Studies and the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these issues with this brilliant panel. And I also have to thank our interpreter who's helping make this panel more accessible. It was really helpful during the last presentation. So I was first asked to speak about my interests in this work. I'm primarily interested in looking at health and human rights in fragile and conflict-affected environments, as noted. There are so many threats to health in these settings at every level. I mean, if we think about hospitals and facilities are bombed, infectious disease risk is high due to overcrowding. Generally, you'll also see high food insecurity, the resulting health issues from that, such as malnutrition, water supplies may be limited or contaminated, and so on and so on. This causes, as you can imagine, some significant societal disruption. A lot of people die. A lot of people try to escape either to another country or a relatively safer part of their country. Industries are destroyed, livelihoods are ruined, and basically the communities left behind are left in tatters. And then the more I studied climate change in tandem with studying conflict, the more I saw how soon we will start to see the effects of climate change throughout the Middle East and Africa especially, the more I started to recognize that our lackluster response to this impending threat that in my mind will be 10 times more disruptive than a war could be, is one of the most pressing issues of our times. Globally, we already have at least 84 million forcibly displaced people, according to the UNHCR. We know that due to lack of data and documentation, that's probably an underestimation. It's probably tens of millions more than that. So when you look at how, quite frankly, ineffectively we've dealt with this pre-existing kind of state fragility related refugee population, you have to wonder how we are going to handle the thousands and then millions and then potentially tens of millions of people that will be displaced due to climate change if we continue along this kind of current path of denial mixed with some superficial efforts that ignore the root causes of these changes in climate. Not to mention that those that migrate due to climate change or environmental degradation that makes their farm unsustainable, or for example, they have no formal status as a refugee in our current conception of refugees, and thus they have no formal mechanisms for financial or social support. Unlike with war, which kind of seems to happen, quickly, we've had decades of warning about climate change. Just in the past few years, we've had report after report released with some really frightening scenarios if current trends continue. We have the rare opportunity to see the incoming threat, and we have the resources and expertise we need to tackle it. But we are still put in a position where those of us who see this threat coming, myself along with those on the panel and many others, we're already seeing the effects of climate change and the lived experiences of millions around the world, yet we are still in a place where we're convincing many in positions of actual power and policy making that climate change is real at all. So to me, it is important to kind of sound the alarm about this because it is the world's poorest and most vulnerable people, and in many environments that includes women, that will feel the effects of climate change first. And aside from the moral imperative to help those that had the least responsibility for getting us in this situation, if the wealthy and highly developed countries of the world think that these effects will stay localized and will not become global crises, I'm afraid they're probably very wrong. While the causal links between climate change and conflict are still debated in the literature, what is clear is that climate change leads to resource scarcity and migration. And while these factors don't inherently lead to conflict, the reaction, they're often handled so poorly that they lead to rise in political tensions, and who knows where that can lead, especially in an already unstable and tense region like the Middle East. So in my work, I focus on the effects of climate change on both conflict-affected populations and in the Middle East and North African region. Often those two groups overlap. The Middle East also already hosts a disproportionate amount of the world's refugee population. I've also done a lot of research and writing about the role of women in global health, where women perform nearly 3/4 of global health work, but fill less than 25% of leadership positions. And this is on top of the disproportionate role of women in performing unpaid work. As one of the previous panelists noted, this includes caregiving of children, of the elderly, of disabled family members, and they have outsized responsibilities in the household. I know we'll get into the gender angle later in the discussion, so I won't belabor those points, but this nexus of conflict, migration, climate change, and gender has become very prominent in my work and much of the emerging work on this field. So I'm very appreciative to have the chance to discuss it here today. Keeping an eye on time, I'll end my opening comments here so we have plenty of time for discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Yara. So we already have a question coming in, so that's great. Please make sure to post your questions if you have any. Maybe I follow up, being again conscious of time and wanting to have a general discussion to sort of ask you all to zoom in a bit more on the gender lens. I mean, clearly there are so many different intersecting axes. I mean, we've heard of the feminization of poverty from Lucilla. I know that Dina has been working on the feminization of agricultural labor. All of you have thought about feminization of migration. So these are the various intersections in the context of climate change and also conflict. And I have to say also personally, I know a little bit more about the fact that, the Middle East is a very vulnerable region in terms of being susceptible to climate change, not only due to its geographical characteristics, but I'm thinking, large number of dry lands, high temperature, water scarcity, but also because of the high number of conflicts and wars. And so I was sort of wondering if all of you could reflect on these wider context and focus then on the specific ways that women might be affected in terms of displacement. So how do women, and here, I mean, as a feminist scholar, I'm always very conscious of trying to balance pointing out the structural inequalities that women are facing without portraying them as passive victims of these structural inequalities. So I guess what I'm interested in, how are women refugees and migrants particularly affected, but what are also some of the coping mechanisms based on the work and experiences you had? So maybe start with, this time, start with Lucilla. Lucilla, would you like to have a first go?
Sí, no hay problema. Estaba pensando lo que decías y la convocatoria de la cual forma parte este proyecto dialoga con África y con Asia. Eso es muy interesante porque ya tuvimos trabajo comparado de la situación de género, cambio climático y desplazamiento o migración. Y en nuestro caso, y creo que en general, pero bueno, puedo hablar de esta particularidad que es la que más conozco, vuelvo a insistir con los cuidados. Trabajamos la categoría nosotras de cuidado ambiental, porque es allí otro cuidado más de los que se hacen cargo las mujeres en los territorios concretos, y que termina siendo una estrategia diferencial, sin victimizar, como bien decías, de salir adelante o intentar revertir las situaciones de injusticia ambiental por las que tienen que pasar. Entonces, en este sentido, son las mujeres las que mayormente se organizan políticamente, se organizan para realizar demandas, y se organizan también para el cuidado del ambiente. Por ejemplo, hay cooperativas de mujeres que trabajan limpiando los arroyos de la vera del área Reconquista, y este trabajo no lo hacen los hombres, ¿no? Entonces, o la mayoría son mujeres. Entonces, en ese sentido, o sea, entendemos que el cuidado ambiental es otra de las mochilas, los pesos que nosotras sumamos al resto de las actividades, o que estas mujeres suman al resto de las actividades. Y desde la parte de no victimizar, también son las mujeres las que revierten en su participación comunitaria, porque la mayoría de las organizaciones comunitarias está liderada por mujeres migrantes, que en muchos casos también migran, además de por una cuestión ambiental, por cuestiones de violencia de género o de sociedades patriarcales que han generado opresiones en sus vidas, y encuentran en el lugar de destino, además de estas injusticias ambientales, una posibilidad mayor de desarrollar el acceso a sus derechos, por lo menos de intentar transformarlos. Dejo ahí, después puedo continuar, pero le doy la palabra a mis compañeras.
Thank you very much, Lucilla. Dina?
Yeah, thank you. Just trying to find the bottom here. Thank you for that question. Well, women that migrate, I mean, I'm not talking about forced migration. There were like mainly two reasons where we found women were migrating. The first one was marriage. They were marrying into another community, and then the other one was that lack of jobs. I think Lucilla just touched on that, patriarchy, and we found that to be very much linked to the environment. So places that were very dry, there were very few opportunities, which were mainly done by men. And then the gender norms around these jobs were very strict. But in communities where there's lots of jobs, like I said, there's irrigation, in need of large labor force, the norms were quite relaxed. So women were doing things that they wouldn't be able to do in their host communities. I think also in these migration contexts where women are migrating, the nuclear family is more like of the labor force when it's related to agriculture. The work, there's more work for women because this extended family is no longer there, and they would be doing again jobs that they cannot do. They usually don't do in their host communities. I mean, this is debatable. This can be good or not good, depending on, for example, if you're a wage worker, then you'll be able to find more jobs in these communities. But if you're an unpaid family worker, then this means that it's more work for you. But also what we found is that when women move into these new spaces, they also carry with them inequalities that were in their host communities. So for example, in Egypt, if you're a woman farmer or if you're a woman wage worker, as opposed to men on the ID, it says housewife per se. So this excludes you from a lot of microcredit opportunities. It excludes you from being in the agricultural cooperative, because if you're a farmer, then you belong to the agricultural cooperative and you get health care. I mean, you can get it through your husband, but if the marriage broke down, so you don't want your benevolence to be dependent on someone else. You also want to have control over that. And also in this migration, in these sending communities, like I said, a lot of times it's to find jobs, and the resources are pooled. As I said before, there were instances where people bought houses, land, mainly like immovable property, as opposed to gold, livestock. These were often based on pooling the household resource, everybody's income, including women's income, and but the name was often in the name of the man. But women were owning, accumulating assets that were highly liquefiable. So this means that this can be alienated. These sources can be alienated from them in the event of illness or any conflict in the house. These assets were the first to be sold. So did I answer your question?
Yes. Thank you
Okay,
very much,
thank you.
Dina. Thanks. Sabine, would you be able to share your views, please?
Yes. Well, I'd say in what I've been focusing in my work always on international migrations and the flows of migrants, of Haitian migrants throughout the region and its intersection with human rights and the labor market. But recently, yes, we have needed to focus on what happens to the gender issue in all of this. And in a recent work that we're doing right now at the border of the Dominican Republic and Haiti, we find that there are three aspects of this intersection that arise as particularly important for the Haitian woman. And I insist because with the human rights issues that affects the relations between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, there's also a race, like they call, issue that we have to take into account, or at least nationality. So it affects women, but it affects Haitian women much more than women in the border overall, in general. The first aspect has to do with the work market. The Haitian migrant women have another professional profile. This different from that of the men who are still and used to be workers of the construction or agriculture, while women migrated much less than men until the 70s or until the 60s, end of the 60s. And the women come to the work market with more qualifications because they're more educated than before, and because there are specific reasons that make them migrate that have to do with the crisis or the change in the Dominican economy that allows them to enter the labor market. The second aspect has to do with the type of exploitation that the migrants are victim at the border or between the two countries. There are specific violences that we all know that occur for women in these migration processes, but particularly for the Haitian woman crossing the border, there are a number of basic rights. We're talking about violence, that we're talking about also not only sexual violence and trata de mujeres, but also that has to do with the basic rights as mothers, as for instance, when they have to give birth in the medical facilities in the Dominican Republic, there are specific discrimination that they suffer. And that, of course, also has implications for all the family, the organization of the whole family, with the children and with the role that they play, that they used to play and that they now play in the new context. Poverty, also more work, less paid. The Haitian woman, when she migrates, she works sometimes more than the men, because the work market has changed and there's more space for them than there was before, or that there is for men, particularly with all the care economy and all the care professions that are related to taking care of the sick and children, all of that. But they are much less paid than the men. And it also affects disproportionately the traditional pattern that there was in the Haitian family, and the role that the men and women used to have. But it's not a change that emancipates the woman. It's a change that puts more workload on them and does not affect the traditional pattern of power between men and women in the family structure.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sabine. I suspect that quite a bit of what you're remarking on would carry across different contexts. Now I would like to ask Yara.
Yes, thank you. So my fellow panelists have touched on so many rich issues in their responses. But so to sum up, climate change does not create gender disparities, but it does exacerbate those that are pre-existing. So when you look at a region like the Middle East that already has significant gender disparities, that it causes so much more potential for negative outcomes. But as Dina said, there are some opportunities anytime there's a significant societal disruption like this. But when you look at the specific disparities faced by women, more likely to live in poverty, less access to basic human rights, including even the right to travel, the right to own their own travel documents, the right to travel without a husband, the right to own their own bank account, the rights to their own land. This really limits their autonomy in making the decisions that are best for them and their family in a quite gendered way. The experiences of migration, it's really hard to generalize because this is one of those areas where intersectional characteristics really play a significant role, especially if it's not forcible migration. So you have race, you have class. I mean, migrating is extremely expensive. If you want to go somewhere and buy property, gain citizenship, be able to fully integrate into your host community. Do you have the educational attainment to be able to do that? Do you have familial support? I mean, that can be a significant marker for women in some of these countries where a lot of the gender disparities are based on these more kind of traditional cultural values. A supportive brother or father can make the difference for a single woman, but what does that tell us about the aggregate? Especially coming out of the Middle East, we're really lacking gender disaggregated data. We simply don't know a lot of how women are disproportionately affected, not just by climate change, but the push factors that lead to migration and also the pull factors of host communities where these women will go. So there's a lot of diversity and experience, but on the whole, as it is today, with the pre-existing gender disparities that we see, it is women who are disproportionately most affected by climate change and least able to do anything about it, both in their communities and also on the broader, higher level policy making.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think it's such an important point, and it came across, of course, in the other contributions as well, that we really have to be careful not to think of women in any essential way. I mean, this is, clearly intersectionality matters a lot, and whatever the specific power configurations are, would then differ from place to place. I mean, I know that in some places in the Middle East, for instance, sectarian religious identities would be one of those markers of difference. But now, Patsy, over to you again.
Yes, thank you. This was a fascinating discussion. And you commented on it already, Nadje, and Yara brought together the commonalities that in terms of how women are positioned globally, not just in the regions we're talking about. But I want to go back to the earlier discussion, and what to me came out of it was the complexity of trying to disentangle migration that is in response to climate change from other forms of migration. Migration tends to become dramatic and comes to the attention of the news. When people cross borders, and especially when there are conflicts or challenges with the crossing of borders. But what your presentations brought out is the importance of thinking of migration within borders that happen not because of some dramatic event as a hurricane, which is very clear where the effects are immediate, Bahamians trying to leave the Bahamas to come to the States and being stopped, or Puerto Ricans moving to the US in the wake of a hurricane. Those are the examples that are more extreme and obvious, but we hardly see the kind of experience that Sabine was talking about, a lake drying up and affecting how people are able to earn, or the ways in which. So how do you and migration is the whole, there's a complex relationship between a country's economic challenges, its social challenges, its political systems, the ability to handle disruptions that all feed into migration and complicates the issues a bit. So the question I really have is, whose responsibility? How do we decide, especially when these movements occur within national borders and they don't occur because of some dramatic event where the relationship with climate change is very visible? But as we go forward, we can expect more and more of these disruptions. Whose responsibility is it to address these? Does responsibility lie with governments, national governments, with the main offenders in the climate change game, or with more of an international thing? So I just want to know if you had perspectives either on that or how you think these complexities are evident in the regions that you're looking at. And it can be a short response because we want to open it up to the audience.
I'll go ahead and get started. So I think you kind of pointed, in my view, to the answer in your question, because climate change is not a product of any single state's actions. It is a concentration of the world's most industrialized and developed states. So in my mind, those states that have benefited economically, socially from the effects of climate change have an outsized responsibility in funding and supporting efforts to support the populations that either have to flee, like you said, due to some natural disaster, or it's just simply not sustainable for them to have, a farm anymore, or the lake dried up, or whatever. In the Middle East, especially, and this is why the region has this kind of unstable reputation, is you have state actors, they're already not responsive to population needs. They're already prioritizing the needs of elites in the population. They're already leaving the most vulnerable and marginalized, and again, that primarily includes women, behind. So we can't leave it to these state entities, although in a perfect world, they would be setting up the infrastructure, they would be shifting to greener policies, they would be on the world stage advocating for policies that these richer, more developed countries should do on the global stage. But their pre-existing kind of almost entirely autocratic, again, very elitist driven governance doesn't lend itself well for that. So rather than kind of waiting in this limbo of who's responsible, I think the states and entities that have the global power and that have the lion's share of the global resources have this outsized role to meet these needs and do it quickly and not wait.
Thank you, Yara. Dina, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so are you asking about how we go next? I'm sorry, I just didn't understand the question. If you'd be kind enough to repeat it.
No, it's who is responsible? Who do you see ultimately as having been responsible for addressing a lot of the displacements that you have spoken about, when it's so difficult to disentangle, when a lot of this is happening internally and not necessarily crossing borders. So, and it's not always that easy to see the direct effects of climate change on these movements.
Yeah, okay, that's a complicated question. I think, yeah, it does happen internally, and not only externally, especially from places where it's getting really, really dry to places where there's more resources there. Rain-fed areas are faring the worst in terms of out-migration, both internationally and internally. Who is responsible? Everybody, international organizations, governments, the people themselves. So to address this, for example, if you're working for the same job and you are paying less, so that your employer needs to be trained, and then also addressing these gender norms that put women in lower paying jobs. Also put regressive policies that have women called housewives on their national IDs. And also the idea of creating more jobs for internal movement for people, you know, like if there's no water in some, and at least that's my experience, it's just so agriculture biased, that there's no water in one place and they move to places where the watershed is very shallow and they can irrigate and have all these cash crop export, cash crop value chains development. These places, it's not enough to create more work. You also want to have social protection during the lean season. You want to enforce existing policies related to sexual harassment, related to the pay gap. So I think everybody has a role to play. And I think agriculture in particular, people in agriculture tend to fare worse because it's really the least paying and it is indeed getting feminized. So making it as an option, you know, not making it as an option of last resort is important. So this can be done through, I guess this would increase the price of food and so on. So a lot needs to be done, even with the export production industries, because it's predicated on cheap labor, women, cheap labor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina, for making the question and issue even more complex and showing its intersections and go beyond what we're seeing. Sabine, would you like to come in?
Yes, very briefly. I understood the question as related to internal displacement and natural disaster within a country and who would be responsible.
That's fine.
In the case of Haiti, yeah, In the case of Haiti, there have been a number of natural disasters that have put forward the lack of public policies related to the welfare of the population in general and the women in particular. So I would say that the national states, the governments, are the first responsible to address these issues because they affect territories which are of their sovereignty. And because the population who suffers these consequences, be it quake or hurricanes or simply the rise of the level of a lake, or the fact that the sea side is being eaten up by the sea, and we make a lot of loss of lands. These issues have to be addressed by, say, the local or national governments. Of course, taking into account that if there are national conventions and national responsibilities, like Jan is saying with a lot, very, very accurately, there needs to be, we need to address the problem in a more international and global level, where the countries more affected are not the countries more responsible. So there needs to be not only a claim, but also laws and principles that help us address the problem at a more global and level with more countries involved and more results, hopefully.
Thank you. Thank you, Sabine. Lucila, you have the last word on this question.
Bueno, yo creo que hay que pensar en los procesos como de larga duración, ¿no? Dentro de, sobre todo el cambio climático, que no es algo que empieza ahora, que es algo que tiene que ver con cómo los seres humanos nos hemos relacionado con nuestro entorno a lo largo de siglos, podría decirse, desde la revolución industrial para adelante. Y yo pienso que la responsabilidad está vinculada también al poder desigual que tienen los estados en el sistema mundial, ¿no? Y con los intereses que eso implica para algunos estados, y sobre todo también me gustaría, no por responsabilidades, pero sí pensando lo que no tiene que ver con desastres naturales, pero tiene que ver también muchas veces porque está vinculado con el sistema de producción, que son el sector privado, ¿no? Que siempre queda por fuera un poco de nuestras reflexiones, y que parecería que el Estado y el sector privado están separados, cuando esto no es así en la mayoría de los países, porque están involucrados de múltiples maneras en la obra pública, con las regulaciones empresariales. Bueno, lo decía Dina también, lo decía Yara, lo decía Sabine, ¿no? Bueno, y Haití, por ejemplo, también es uno de los casos donde se piensa, bueno, el Estado nacional debería resolverlo, pero hay un montón de organismos internacionales que están en Haití hace mucho tiempo, y sin embargo las tensiones siguen estando en muchos casos, y lo mismo en cada uno de nuestros países, ¿no? Yo pienso y digo, bueno, todos sabemos las caras de nuestros presidentes, nadie sabe las caras muchas veces de los empresarios que verten en los ríos agroquímicos, en el caso de mi lugar, ¿no? Digo, entonces, generalmente desde las investigaciones no hacemos mucho hincapié en el sector privado también, que también están relacionados con el sistema, vuelvo a decir, de opresión hacia las mujeres, porque son también ellos, en muchos casos, en connivencia con el Estado, los que no pagan a las mujeres los que deberían pagarle, y las mantienen en condiciones de irregularidades, bueno, en connivencia o en asociación con los estados nacionales, ¿no? Pero digo, me gustaría abrir un poquito la puerta a pensar también el papel del sector empresarial, que muchas veces está oculto o está vedado, y toda la responsabilidad está sobre los políticos, que son responsables, pero que también están asociados en muchas decisiones con los privados, y también la importancia de que estemos las mujeres en los puestos de decisión política y en los puestos empresariales, que creo que generaría una mirada mucho más hermenéutica completa de los procesos de sostenibilidad de la vida, podría decirse, ¿no? Y esto se ha evidenciado en muchos lugares donde las mujeres hemos comenzado a ocupar lugares privilegiados, ¿no? Sobre todo las mujeres de clase media alta, esta es la realidad lamentablemente, y ha habido transformaciones desde el punto de vista de las visiones, ¿no? De las instituciones. Con esto dejo a mis compañeras también.
Thank you, Nadje.
Yeah, thank you all. Well, I mean, this so many things come up. I mean, I think that this point, I think is so important. I mean, there were so many different points, but this idea that, because I think it's so prevalent that the countries that are most affected are supposed to be the one most active. And, you know, this is of course a really, really big issue and problem. And we really need to rethink that and rethink what does a global response mean. And I think there are parallels, of course, in terms of the current COVID pandemic, you know, that it's really not possible to think in these sort of local national terms, and everyone just sort of looking out for themselves is not going to be the solution. I think there are parallels. But I'd like to now move to a question here in the Q&A, and I'd like to encourage others to also post their questions or comments if they have any. So this is a question by Elizabeth Fussell. Thanks, Yara, for your comments. Are climate migrants expected to migrate across international borders in the same way that conflict migrants do? Or will most climate migrants, with the exception of those from small island states that are inundated, stay within their national borders? I mean, this is quite a hypothetical question. I don't know, I don't think all of you need to speak to it, but if anyone would like to, please, would be great.
I'll just briefly start. You know, I think it really, really, really depends on the impetus for the migration. Was it a sudden natural disaster, an earthquake, a hurricane, or something really significant, like suddenly the water supply is gone, or some infectious disease has taken out all your livestock? If it's an acute crisis like that, versus over time, a agricultural family sees that their yields are not as good, their livestock is not producing as well, you know, there's a big difference in why people migrate from these regions. So I think that is the first question to ask, and where will people go? Is there somewhere else in their country to go? You know, especially within the Middle East, North Africa, these are smaller states. They're already increasingly urban. There's this kind of abandonment of the kind of rural lifestyle that we're seeing more so. So I think more people might be looking for opportunities outside of their borders. On the other hand, it really also depends on personal circumstances. Again, if you don't have a UNHCR to support your migration, as climate, quote unquote, climate refugees don't, you have to fund that. So either you have already the personal capability to, you know, pay for a citizenship in the citizen or a residency process in another country, pay to pick up your entire family, move your goods, or you are kind of fleeing on foot, you're using, you know, human traffickers, for example. That really depends on where you can end up as well. So as you said, and Nadje, it's kind of it's a hypothetical, but it's also greatly dependent on individual circumstances, as well as the circumstances of the state or the community where you're fleeing.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Although I'm not a panelist, can I come in here? I think that this discussion is fascinating, because you start off, well, at least I started off thinking more of the international implications, people crossing borders, right? But when I reflect on the experiences that I know in the Caribbean with natural disasters, in Grenada, for example, I'm not going to remember which hurricane it is now, really inundated a coastal village, a fisherman's, which is a fishing village. The fishermen were to be relocated away from the coastline. And interestingly, in this case, it was Chinese money that came to the rescue, quote unquote, but they were moved further inland because it didn't make sense to relocate them back on the shoreline. But that caused a lot of anxieties because their livelihood was based on living close to the sea. And I'm saying that because the question of leaving Grenada to migrate is not even something that anybody wanted. It's not something on the agenda. These people wanted to be able to resume their lives and live it the way in which they could. The more recent example is the volcanic explosion in St. Vincent, where the Regional Organization of Eastern Caribbean States actually had countries volunteer to host up to 20,000 Vincentians who were displaced. Well, nobody wanted to leave St. Vincent. They didn't even want to leave their homes, much less leaving the country to go to another country. So I think that we have to remember, and this discussion has really zeroed in on people and the value people place on living their lives in a particular geographical location with family connections and histories. And it's important to remember that it's not just the big movements across borders, but it's the way people really want to be able to live their lives with some degree of continuity and historical groundedness. So I just thought that came out beautifully in this discussion.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Would anyone else like to follow up on this, or should I go to the next question? There are a couple of questions. Okay.
Solamente
yeah,
me
sure.
gustaría decir que en el sentido de lo que planteaba Patsy, nosotros desde los estudios migratorios siempre hablamos del derecho humano a no migrar, ¿no? También en el sentido de que las personas puedan permanecer en sus lugares de origen con las condiciones de vida dignas. Eso solamente. Gracias.
Maybe also recall that even in countries that have a lot of expulsion of migrants, so people like Haiti, which is a highly migratory country, most people do not leave their village or their place, their community. They don't want to, and they don't. Usually they come back, even after the 2 earthquakes, people tend to go back to their communities and do as much as they can not to have to go.
Can I just say something here?
Sure, of course.
In agriculture, what we also see is that the ability of few people to migrate allows others to stay and sustain their livelihoods in agriculture. And then also we have seasonal migration. In Egypt, young men go to Jordan to work on construction, and then they come back and they get married, and then they don't go back again. It's like a rite of passage for these men in rural areas. So yeah, I'm just adding a bit that it can be really fluid. This international migration, it could sustain people, other household members not to migrate. It sustains these communities. I mean, look at Lebanon. The reason why the whole country exists, especially now, is because there's remittances.
Sure. Yeah, so that's an added complication to the whole story. Yes, thank you, Dina. Okay, I'm going to read out a couple of questions now, and then anyone who would like to address any of the questions is welcome. The first one is by Alana Finn. How can small island developing states utilize debt for climate swaps to combat climate change? And Ian McDonald, thank you all for the excellent presentations. Does anyone have any thoughts on the dynamics of disaster capitalism we have seen in the wake of events such as Hurricane Maria, and what this could look like as a result of future displacements. Okay, so one question very specifically to small islands, another question about disaster capitalism, and then a question for Dina specifically. So Dina, if you can keep a note of that, from Karim Said. In the context of Tunisia, I know that women already living in agricultural areas pursue agricultural labor as a last resort. I'm less familiar with women migrating for this work. Can you shed some light on why this kind of work would be desirable and why it would motivate women to migrate? Okay, so lots of questions. So maybe we start with the first one on how can small island developing states utilize that for climate swaps to combat climate change? Anyone like to speak to that?
Maybe I should shed some light, but I'm not sure I understood the question. Can you repeat, please? It's about small islands, but
yes.
what's
so,
the question?
Yeah, so the question is about, I don't understand it either because it's very technical, but maybe Patsy, you do?
I will not presume to comment on things that I don't understand. I've never quite understood the climate, the swapping, climate swaps, where you basically compensate for using resources by protecting forests somewhere else. And I think this is a concept that's been transferred to debt. Small states are highly indebted. They're some of the most highly indebted countries in the world. And there are obvious reasons for that, which we won't go into. And this person is asking if there's a way to use that same kind of system as a way to reduce debt. I cannot answer. I would suggest that it depends on who holds the debt. I'm not quite sure how transferable that is in that way, but I have a problem with the whole idea of transferring because to me it's also a way of getting away from your responsibility to, produce differently and to address climate change at home. And I don't mean small states, I mean the big offenders, by this gesture of, okay, we're protecting somewhere else. But as I said, that's a technical question, which I suspect that the person who posed the question has clear ideas on this. It's a pity that they can't jump on and share these with us. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thanks, Patsy.
No, I will abstain. I will just, okay.
Sorry. So maybe we move to the question, would anyone like to comment on the dynamics of disaster capitalism? So, I mean, they're mentioning, this is Ian MacDonald mentioning specifically events like Hurricane Maria, but I think it's of course a wider issue, disaster capitalism. And what could disaster capitalism look like as a result of future displacements? Anyone would like to come in here? No.
I can jump in here if you wish. Sabine, you wanted to address it?
Disaster capitalism is a concept that I do not really. I understand what it means, but I'm not. It doesn't convince me as such. Maybe it seems to me more important to focus on how particular neoliberal economies and choices have made most of the populations in most countries, be them rich or poor, or richer or poorer, where the majority of the population is living the consequences of a system that works for the few, but that is working even more every day more for the few and leaving the majorities behind, or putting them in a context of urgency, of stress, of threat.
Sabine has frozen. Can I just come in here just to say that, not for long, just briefly.
That oblige them to what was it?
Yeah, thank you, Sabine. Yeah, you were breaking up at some point, but thanks. I think we got most of it. Yeah. Patsy wanted to.
I just wanted to jump on to say, I think that there's a valid question about disaster capitalism that we don't have to rehash here, but I think that it's a very real thing that, you know, people come in and donors tend to also privilege their own companies and people were in the rebuilding process. And I think that one of the things that we don't think about is how local knowledge and expertise are sidelined in disasters. And it becomes an opportunity for the bearers of ideas, the superior beings, to come and tell you how to do what you know how to do. And in a context where unemployment is high, that your people are marginalized from these opportunities, which are then available to the so-called international community. So I think it's a real issue, but I would stop here.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's a parallel, of course, the way that works in the context of post-conflict reconstruction. I mean, there's a big link to that as well. I'm conscious of time. We have to wrap up. So I would like to ask Dina maybe to very briefly, in a couple of minutes, answer the question posed to you. Thanks, Dina.
So thanks, Karam. Just let me start to say that agriculture, women in the Middle East, in Tunisia included, Middle East and North Africa, have the highest rate for participation in the workforce, despite significant gains in educational attainment in the past few decades. However, the largest employer for women in the region is agriculture. And what we have seen is that men tend to start in these poor areas or poor families. They tend to start in a wage work, and it is an option of last resort. However, they move up into and out of agriculture. So they start with being wage workers, they accumulate some money, and then they go on to work, buy a tuk-tuk, taxi, open a shop, and we have seen them move up and above and out of agriculture, or they might become a permanent worker on a commercial farm, and so on. Now with women, they start from even a more disadvantaged position. So most of these women that are working in agriculture are women that have to work, and as such, like they're widows, or they come from they're single mothers, so as such, or they come from very poor families, or they don't have a father, they're working to raise money to have a trousseau. So as such, what we see is that these women spend the money on food or spend the money on a specific thing. So they can't really accumulate the money and move out of agriculture. And there's, because of gender norms related to mobility, and also it's shameful to work in certain, like in an office, like these norms are very important in determining where women can work. They don't move out of agriculture. So why do they migrate? Because like I said, in these areas where they live in, the opportunities are much less and the pay is lower in these rain-fed areas. But in areas where there's irrigation and connection to export markets, there's a large need, especially there's sometimes seasonal workers during harvest season, during planting season. where there's a huge need for agricultural labor, and employers love to hire women because they are paid less, they work harder, and they tell you that. And women play with patriarchy. You know, they use that to their advantage. They know that they are desired because they are paid less, and sometimes they opt working in a group they work with this patriarchal system to avoid harassment, to lobby for higher wage. So they do have they do have their own agency in this, but you know, much more needs to be done. So I guess I hope I answered your question, Karam.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, unfortunately, we've run out of time. I mean, fascinating. It's really, I think, what all of you have shown very clearly, that, you know, there are certain patterns and certain dynamics that, you know, one can sort of generalize and speak about. But when you get to the level of really the kind of empirical specific context, not only does the whole situation, the whole dynamics gain much more complexity and nuance, but also some surprising twists at times. And it's really important to, I guess, keep hold of both trends, the sort of wider patterns, but also the specifics. I mean, I'm sorry that we have to stop here. I'd like to thank all of you for this fascinating, quite depressing, of course, discussion, but I think you have also given us some important food for thought. And I mean, especially when it comes to climate change, it is so important that we don't stay just at the level of being depressed, but really first of all, think that there is still hope for action, but also, you know, the ability for us to do things and to recognize other people, how they're coping. But it's this really difficult balance. Thank you. I would now like to pass over to my colleague, Professor Patsy Lewis, and just to say that this session will be later on available as a webinar, recorded webinar. We'll make it available. Thank you. Patsy?
Yeah, I just want to end, we're way over time, by just thanking you all for giving a lot of serious thought to these questions, and for informing us more about how complex the issues are, you know, generally, and, you know, how this might play out in specific cases. So I just want to say thank you. It was a wonderful, engaging discussion, and I look forward to many more of these going forward. So thank you all very much. It's lovely to meet you. And thank you to Barbara and Kate,
Yes.
and John Marcel, all of you for
and the interpreter.
And yes, for us running this smoothly, and our interpreter, our excellent interpreter.
Yes,
I'm particularly grateful for her. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Everyone.